The dinner was held on the top floor of a glass building that reflected the city lights like a trophy. My sister's company was celebrating a record quarter, and she had invited our parents to meet the leadership team. I came because my mother insisted. "You should support your sister," she said. "It's important to show unity." Unity. The room buzzed with polished conversation, tailored suits, controlled laughter, glasses clinking with quiet confidence. My sister moved easily between executives, her posture sharpened by success. When she reached our table with her CEO beside her, my mother stood proudly. "And this," she said, placing her hand lightly on my shoulder, "is my other daughter." A pause. "She's the failed one." The word landed softly, almost disguised as humor. A few people chuckled politely. Someone muttered, "Every family has one." My sister smiled tightly, not correcting it. "She's still figuring things out," she added. "Still figuring things out." I felt the familiar tightening in my chest, but I didn't flinch. The CEO looked at me, briefly polite but dismissive. Another executive nodded, as if the hierarchy had just been clarified. Failed. It wasn't the first time the label had been used. But this was the first time it echoed through a room full of people who measured worth in titles and valuation. I held my portfolio folder close to my side and smiled. What they didn't know was that I had signed the acquisition 3 days earlier. My sister has always been introduced with an accomplishment attached to her name. Harvard. Vice President. Fast-tracked. Even when we were children, the narrative was clear. She was the one with direction. The one who answered questions quickly. The one teachers described as exceptional. My parents didn't create that reputation intentionally, they reinforced it naturally. At family gatherings, relatives would ask her about her latest promotion. My mother would beam and recount performance reviews as if reading scripture. My father would mention leadership potential before anyone else had the chance. I was described differently. "She's creative. She's exploring. She hasn't settled yet." Settled. The word carried an implication. While my sister followed a straight, visible path, Ivy League to corporate analyst to executive leadership, I chose complexity. Consulting roles. Strategic advisory work. Confidential negotiations. My career wasn't linear. It was layered. My family layer looked unstable. When I left a visible role to take on a restructuring contract under NDA, my mother whispered to a cousin that I was in between jobs again. My sister once told me, half concerned, half superior, "You just need something consistent." Consistency in her mind meant predictability. In mine it meant leverage. The contrast between us became identity. She had upward mobility. I was potentially wasted. They praised her publicly and corrected me privately. At dinner tables, she spoke about growth metrics and quarterly targets. I spoke less. Not because I had nothing to say, because I had nothing I was permitted to disclose. And silence when misunderstood looks like failure. By the time my mother introduced me as the failed daughter, the label had already been rehearsed for years. They believed they understood the hierarchy. They just didn't understand the structure beneath it. My work has never photographed well. There are no ribbon cuttings. No headline announcements. No polished LinkedIn posts about, "Excited to share this milestone." My career exists mostly in conference rooms with closed doors and contracts stamped confidential. I work in corporate restructuring and mergers. When companies begin to collapse under poor leadership or expand beyond what their structure can support, I step in. Not publicly. Not ceremonially. Strategically. My role is evaluation, risk assessment, asset reallocation, integration oversight. None of that translates easily at family dinners. When I left my last visible position, I did so because a private firm recruited me to lead an acquisition review. The contract required discretion from day one. I signed an NDA before I signed the offer letter. For months my calendar looked empty from the outside. No office badge. No corporate email signature to display. To my family, that absence looked like drift. "You quit again?" my sister asked when she heard. I transitioned, I corrected. But transition doesn't satisfy people who equate motion with instability. They never asked what I was building. They asked when I would find something secure. Secure. The irony is that restructuring requires more precision than climbing a ladder. It requires knowing where the weaknesses are hidden. My silence was not uncertain. It was contractual. I couldn't disclose the merger I was overseeing. I couldn't announce the executive authority embedded in the paperwork sitting in my portfolio. So they filled the silence with assumption. They labeled discretion as failure. They mistook confidentiality for incompetence. And when my mother called me the failed daughter, she wasn't inventing the narrative. She was repeating one they had grown comfortable believing. The first introduction could have passed as careless humor. The second made it deliberate. As dessert was served and the conversation drifted toward performance bonuses, my mother leaned toward my sister's CEO. "You must love having her on your team," she said, nodding proudly toward my sister. Then gesturing lightly in my direction, she added, "This one took a different route. She's our failed daughter." The word hung longer this time. Failed. There was no nervous laugh from her. No attempt to soften it. It was delivered with the ease of something often repeated. My sister smiled at the small controlled curve of her lips. Not embarrassed. Not defensive. Almost amused. "She's still figuring things out," she added as if clarifying for the room. The table responded with polite laughter again, though it carried a sharper edge. One executive tilted his head sympathetically. Another avoided eye contact altogether. I felt the temperature shift, not in the room but in myself. It wasn't anger. It was awareness. My portfolio rested against my knee beneath the table. The leather edge pressed lightly against my hand, grounding. My sister's CEO had been reaching for his glass when my mother repeated the word. He paused mid-movement. He didn't laugh. Instead, he looked at me more carefully. "You're in transition?" he asked, voice neutral but observant. Before I could answer, my mother waved dismissively. "It's complicated." The room waited for me to either confirm or retreat. I did neither. I held the CEO's gaze calmly, because humiliation only works when you accept the definition being assigned. And I had no intention of doing that. I had brought the folder for practical reasons. That afternoon my schedule had been packed with integration calls, document reviews, and a last-minute request from my team. "We need you to sign off on the preliminary risk assessment before the board meeting tomorrow." If I didn't bring what I needed, I'd be delayed. If I was delayed, I'd be blamed later for something no one bothered to explain clearly. So I brought my portfolio. It wasn't a prop. It wasn't styled to impress. It was simply functional black thick leather, the kind that doesn't show wear because it expects to be used. The clasp clicked when I opened it at the start of the evening, even though I didn't truly have to. I could already picture what was inside. The confidential acquisition review summary, the integration roadmap, the executive overview that summarized what most people only saw as merging opportunities. My sister and her CEO called it growth. I called it exposure. And I knew exactly which division would be affected first if the merger's terms triggered a restructuring clause. I knew which departments would lose headcount due to compliance integration. I knew which leadership roles were at risk if there were staffing overlaps. That knowledge lived on paper in my folder. While everyone else was laughing at me, assuming I was behind schedule, my folder sat heavy against my leg, calm as gravity. At some point during dessert, my sister's CEO glanced at my hand when I shifted in my seat. His eyes caught the folder's logo, faint, discreet, but unmistakable if you knew where to look. I didn't see his reaction right away. I only felt it. The way his attention tightened by a fraction. The way his smile held steady but stopped being casual. My mother's voice turned smug again when she thought I wasn't listening. "Well, she probably doesn't understand how this works," she said softly, as if offering comfort to the room. I kept my expression neutral and opened the folder just once, enough to show a page marked with bold headings and a signature block at the bottom. On that page, my name was not failed daughter. It was not unstable. It was not a joke. It was an executive authorization. And the people laughing were already standing on the side of the timeline where they weren't supposed to be able to fall. My sister was in the middle of describing her department's quarterly performance when my father-in-law interrupted to add context. "They've exceeded targets 3 quarters in a row," he said proudly, as if he were part of the executive team himself. "The company's expanding aggressively." "Strategic expansion," my sister corrected gently. "We're positioning for regional integration." Regional integration. The phrase landed differently for me. Across the table, executives nodded approvingly. Terms like valuation, market share, and synergy moved easily through the conversation. They spoke about the upcoming merger as if it were inevitable, as if success were already sealed. My sister's confidence was unshaken. We've built strong internal leadership, she added. My division is one of the most stable. Stable. I resisted the urge to glance at the portfolio beside my chair. The merger wasn't a rumor. It was in its final review stage. My firm had flagged operational redundancies, leadership overlaps, departments that would need consolidation for efficiency, including hers. The executives around the table didn't know that a restructuring model had already been drafted, that performance metrics were being reevaluated, that some positions would shift, some would be reassigned, and others would dissolve quietly under the language of integration. My sister spoke about security. I thought about assessment. My mother smiled proudly, absorbing the praise as if it were familial inheritance. She's always been the successful one, she said. Successful. The irony was precise. Because the future they were celebrating had already been analyzed, measured, and adjusted within the pages resting silently at my side. They were discussing permanence. I knew better. And the collision between perception and reality was getting closer. The moment happened quickly, almost too quietly to register at first. My sister had just finished outlining her team's projected growth when her CEO leaned closer to her. It wasn't dramatic. Just a subtle shift of posture and a lowered voice. He glanced in my direction. Then he whispered, "That's my boss." I saw my sister's expression change before anyone else did. It wasn't disbelief. It was a recalculation. "What?" she murmured under her breath. He kept his tone even. "She's leading the integration review." Integration review. The phrase cut through the room even though it wasn't spoken loudly. My sister's spine straightened. Her glass paused midair. For a fraction of a second her eyes met mine, not with superiority this time but with sudden awareness. The laughter from earlier felt distant now. She looked back at her CEO. "You're serious?" He nodded once. "Very." The table hadn't fully grasped the exchange yet, but the energy had shifted. Executives who had been half listening leaned slightly closer. My mother noticed the change in posture before she understood the reason. "What is it?" she asked. My sister didn't answer immediately. She was connecting timelines. The merger announcement. The confidentiality clauses. The silent executive at the table who hadn't defended herself. Failed daughter. The word seemed fragile now. I remained still, my hands resting calmly on the table. I didn't need to clarify, because the whisper had already done it. And sometimes the most powerful shifts begin not with speeches but with 3 quiet words spoken at the right time. The CEO set his glass down deliberately. "Actually," he said, raising his voice just enough to command attention without appearing dramatic, "I should properly introduce someone." The table was still. He turned toward me with professional composure, the kind reserved for boardrooms rather than family dinners. "This is the Senior Integration Director overseeing our acquisition review." He didn't need to say my name loudly. The weight of the title did the work. My mother blinked. My father-in-law straightened instinctively. My sister's expression was no longer amused. It was measured. "You're leading the review?" my sister asked carefully. "My team is," I replied evenly. "I'm responsible for the structural evaluation." There was no triumph in my voice. Just precision. "Structural evaluation?" my father-in-law repeated. "Governance alignment. Department consolidation. Operational redundancies," I said calmly. "Standard procedure during integration." The words sounded neutral, but they carried implications. My sister's department was one of the largest cost centers in the company. The internal assessment had already identified overlaps. Some roles would shift. Some would merge. Her certainty earlier about stability now had context. "You didn't mention this," my mother said quietly. "I wasn't asked," I answered. The CEO nodded. "The review has been thorough," he added. "We're confident in her leadership." Her leadership. The phrase reframed the entire evening. For years my family had measured worth by visible promotion. By the corporate ladder. By the ability to describe one's position in simple terms. My work didn't photograph well. It restructured quietly. "You're the one making recommendations?" my sister asked. "I will make assessments," I said. "Recommendations follow data." The room absorbed that sentence carefully. No one laughed. No one was dismissed. Because this wasn't about personality or perception. It was about authority embedded in the process. My father-in-law cleared his throat. We were just discussing growth projections. I'm aware, I replied. Growth is sustainable when structure supports it. The inversion was not loud. It was structural. They had introduced me as the failed daughter. The executive at the table had introduced me differently. And titles, when spoken by the right person, recalibrate entire rooms. I didn't correct anyone. I didn't remind them of the earlier laughter. I simply existed in the position they had never bothered to imagine. Power doesn't announce itself with anger. It clarifies itself through context. And the context had just shifted. No one reached for their glasses. The room, which had felt buoyant with self-assurance minutes earlier, settled into something far heavier. My sister looked down at her hands first, as if recalculating every statement she had made that evening. The confidence she wore so comfortably began to thin, replaced by something closer to analysis. You're overseeing our division too? She asked carefully. Every division, I replied. Not sharply. Not softly. Just a fact. My mother's expression shifted from confusion to discomfort. We had no idea, she said. I know. That was the point. My father-in-law adjusted his posture as if the physical act might restore control. Well, he began cautiously, this is certainly impressive. Impressive. The word felt fragile now. Across the table, a junior executive who had laughed earlier avoided my eyes entirely. The air in the room was no longer warm with amusement. It was structured, aware. My sister straightened slightly. So this integration, will it change things? She asked. It already has, I answered. Silence returned, deeper this time. The hierarchy that had existed at the beginning of the evening, golden daughter, failed sister, collapsed without confrontation. Not because I argued. Because context rearranged the architecture of assumption. My mother opened her mouth as if to repair something, then closed it again. There was nothing to correct. The narrative had shifted on its own. And no one laughed again. She caught up with me in the hallway outside the private dining room. Can we talk? She asked. Her tone was no longer performative. It was carefully controlled. Of course, I said. We stepped aside from the table and the lingering tension. The hum of the restaurant felt distant now. You didn't tell me, she said at first. I wasn't permitted to, I replied. She folded her arms, not defensively but to steady herself. Does this mean my department is at risk? It means every department is being evaluated, I answered. Based on structure, not personality. She studied my face, searching for something personal. A grudge. A reaction. This isn't about dinner, is it? She asked. No, I said calmly. Dinner was social. This is structural. There was a long pause. You could have corrected them earlier, she added quietly. I could have, I agreed. But authority doesn't require public defense. She nodded once, absorbing the distinction. I never meant. I know, I interrupted gently. But intent and impact aren't identical. She exhaled slowly. I need to understand where we stand, she said. You stand where the data places you, I replied. That's how integration works. No accusation. No retaliation. Just a boundary. She looked at me differently, than not as the sister who drifted between roles, but as the professional who didn't bend context to accommodate comfort. When we returned to the table, the hierarchy was no longer assumed. It was defined. And definition is quieter than confrontation. The integration proceeded exactly as planned. There were no dramatic announcements, no abrupt terminations. The restructuring unfolded through scheduled meetings, documented reviews, and performance assessments. Departments were consolidated. Overlapping leadership roles were merged. Operational redundancies were addressed. My sister's division was not eliminated, but it was recalibrated. Some of her authority shifted upward. Certain projects were reassigned. Budget approvals required additional oversight. The language used in internal memos was neutral realignment, efficiency optimization, structural streamlining. There was no mention of dinner. No personal references. Only compliance. She adapted professionally. I watched her recalibrate in meetings, adjusting her tone, refining her strategy presentations. The arrogance I had grown accustomed to seeing softened into something more measured. She never accused me of targeting her. Because she knew I hadn't. Every recommendation was documented. Every decision is traceable. The data spoke more clearly than emotion ever could. My mother called once during the process. "Is everything all right?" she asked. "It's proceeding," I replied. Proceeding. That was the most honest word available. The consequences weren't explosive. They were educational. For the first time, my sister understood what it felt like to have her position evaluated objectively without the cushion of family narrative. And I understood something too. Correction doesn't require revenge. It requires structure. And the structure rarely shouts. The dinner is already becoming a story my family tells differently. The details have softened. The laughter has been minimized. The introduction has been reframed as a misunderstanding. But I remember it clearly. Not because it hurt, because it revealed something precise. For years they believed success had a visible shape. A title, a salary, a promotion that could be repeated at holiday gatherings without explanation. My career never fit neatly into that format. It required silence, patience, confidentiality. I allowed that silence to be mistaken for absence. I don't resent them for misunderstanding. I resent the certainty with which they are labeled. Failure is a label used by people who don't understand strategy. Strategy is often invisible until it shifts the entire structure. What changed that night wasn't my role. It was their awareness. They stopped confusing visibility with value. They stopped equating applause with authority. And I stopped feeling obligated to translate myself into something digestible. I don't need them to celebrate my contracts. I need them to respect the work. Respect isn't demanded loudly. It is established quietly through context and consistency. That dinner didn't transform my family, clarified me. And clarity is stronger than validation. Because when the room recalibrated, I didn't rise above them. I simply stood where I had always been,